The wind blew gently through the hills of Charleston, carrying the scent of old leaves and long-kept memories. At the top of the hill, where the town looked like a distant painting, stood Whitmore Mansion, imposing yet silent. Inside, Harold Whitmore, the widowed billionaire, spent his days among dusty hallways and closed windows, as if waiting for something that would never come. He was a 78-year-old man, with eyes that had seen much, and a heart that had felt too deeply. Since the death of his wife, Margaret, 12 years ago, Harold had received no visitors, not even at Christmas. He woke up every day at 6 a.m., drank bitter coffee, and read the newspaper the gardener left at the gate. His footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, but there were no sounds of laughter, no voices, only the ticking of the old clock she had once chosen. That autumn afternoon, Harold opened the front door as he always did to get the paper. But something was different. A small beige envelope with slightly curved corners rested on the porch steps. No sender, no address, just his name, handwritten, Harold. He looked around. Nothing, not a soul in sight. The garden remained still, and the iron gate was still closed. He picked up the envelope carefully, as if it were too fragile to exist. He returned inside and placed it on the oak table where Margaret used to write her letters, but he didn't open it. Not yet. Harold spent the day looking at the note as one looks into an old mirror, afraid of what might be reflected. Only when the clock struck midnight did he finally break the red wax seal. "You don't know me, but I know you. I know the sadness in your eyes, because mine carries the same weight. I write because I believe even the most cracked hearts can be touched again. I return here every Thursday. If you want to see me, leave the porch light on." The handwriting was firm, feminine, full of curves like the love letters from decades past. Harold stood still, feeling the weight of those words, as if someone had gently touched his chest. He went up to the attic, a place he hadn't visited in years. There, among boxes of keepsakes and Margaret's wedding dress still carefully stored, he found a box of letters, all exchanged between them in the 1960s. And then he cried, not from longing, but because for the first time in a long while he felt seen. Someone out there noticed him. Someone was waiting for something from him. The next morning, Harold spent hours on the porch. He thought of 1,000 possibilities. Who could it be? Someone from the past, a prank, or destiny? The following Thursday, just before sunset, he turned on the porch light. It was a small gesture, but for an old and wounded heart, it was the beginning of everything. The light stayed on all night. Harold sat in his favorite armchair facing the window, watching the distant gate. He knew it was unlikely that anyone would appear, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That Thursday, the silence felt different, denser, as if the air carried secrets. He didn't sleep. When the clock struck 3 in the morning, he went to the porch, carefully stepped down the stairs, and found something new. A flower, a white camellia, still damp with dew. And next to it another note, this one shorter. "Thank you for the light, that was already a beginning." Harold held the flower like someone holds an old name and smiled with tearful eyes. The next day, while having coffee, Harold was surprised by Edith, his former housekeeper. She came once a week to check supplies and drop off a few meals she cooked with care, even though he insisted it wasn't necessary. Edith was a 72-year-old woman, practical, but with an attentive gaze. "That flower there, is it new?" she asked, pointing to the camellia on the table. Harold hesitated. "It appeared on the porch last night." Edith paused for a moment. "White camellia, just like the ones Margaret used to grow in the back garden." He looked up, surprised. "They haven't bloomed there in years." Edith simply nodded, as if she knew more than she said. In the days that followed, Harold resumed his old habit of walking through the garden. He walked slowly, observing the paths Margaret used to walk with a basket of flowers on her arm. He remembered the afternoons when she sang, the mornings when she wrote poems on the porch. And then something stirred, the desire to reorganize the greenhouse. The plants were dry, covered in dust, but there was something comforting about digging in the earth, feeling the smell of living roots, as if life could somehow be replanted. On Friday, he returned to the porch, as if expecting another sign. But there was no letter, no flower, only silence. And yet, something inside him was moving. On Sunday, Harold decided to write. He sat at the old desk, took the aged paper and the fountain pen Margaret had given him on his 40th birthday. He wrote without thinking too much. The words came like old dreams, full of pain and beauty. I don't know who you are, but I know your gesture sparked something I thought was dead. For 12 years my house was just walls, and your letter, your flower, it made it breathe again. Thank you. If you wish to continue, I'll be here every Thursday with the light on. He folded the letter carefully and placed it under a stone on the edge of the porch, where the previous note had been left. It was strange to write to someone he didn't know, but it was even stranger to feel again. The next Thursday, Harold didn't have to think. At 7 p.m. sharp, he turned on the porch light and sat with the letter in his lap. The wind was cold and the sky was clear. At 9 p.m., he heard something. Light footsteps, quick, an almost shy sound on the gravel path leading to the gate. He stood up slowly. For the first time in years, someone was there. He couldn't see the face. The person had already dropped something at the gate and quickly left. Harold walked over and found an envelope with a blue ribbon. Inside was a poem. Among camellias and forgotten lights lie hearts that still beat. Even among the ruins, love waits. Harold returned inside, holding the envelope to his chest. That night, he dreamed of Margaret. But for the first time, he didn't wake up crying. Her image seemed to smile, as if saying, "Go, continue." He knew whatever was beginning was just the beginning. The poem remained above the fireplace, as if it were a centerpiece in the room. Harold read and reread the verses, trying to find clues. Who would write something so sensitive? Who knew the value of the white camellia, of the porch light, of the pain he carried? The next morning, he visited the bookstore downtown, something he hadn't done in over a decade. He was looking for something, maybe for her. That's when he heard the voice. Among camellias and forgotten lights, someone murmured behind him. He turned slowly. It was a woman, grey hair tied in a loose bun, glasses hanging on her nose, and a blue scarf around her neck. She must have been in her early 70s. She noticed he was watching and smiled gently. "Sorry." That line came to my mind. It's from a poem I wrote a long time ago. Harold's heart jumped quietly. Her name was Amelia North, a widow, retired literature teacher. She lived 2 blocks down from the Whitmore mansion. For years, she passed by that house and wondered what was behind those closed windows. When she found out from the housekeeper Edith that Harold lived there, she felt an inexplicable impulse. She decided to write the note, but she didn't expect a response. She didn't expect light. "I thought maybe it was too late," she said, as the two of them had tea at the bookstore. "It's never too late," he replied, without realizing it was the first time in many years that he was having tea with someone. The following week, Amelia gave Harold a black and white photograph, slightly faded. It was a party, a group of young people smiling on a lawn, and among them, Margaret, young, with flowers in her hair and the same smile as always. "I found this among my old books. I think it was in 1967, at a party at the North's house." Harold stared in silence. In the background of the photo, a familiar figure, himself, and next to him a young woman in a floral dress, Amelia. They had crossed paths more than 50 years ago. "You were there?" he asked, touching the edge of the photo. "Yes, and I remember Margaret saying you wrote letters like you were planting gardens." Harold laughed, surprised. "She said that?" "She did, and she was right." Moved by that memory, Harold returned to the attic and found a trunk he hadn't opened in decades. Inside, yellowed letters, notebooks with poems, and a small radio Margaret used to listen to jazz. He found among the papers a draft of a letter never sent, addressed to someone named A. North. It was a thank you note, a gentle farewell, as if Margaret had tried to tie up loose ends before leaving. Harold brought the letter to Amelia. She read it in silence, emotional. "Margaret wrote to me," she whispered, "but I never received it. Maybe now is the right time." The following week, Harold invited Amelia to walk through the mansion's garden. It was the first time someone had walked beside him there since Margaret died. Among dry roses and tall trees, they laughed. They talked about books, music, silence. Amelia told how she lost a child at 4 years old. A silly accident. A swing. A branch that broke. She never got over it, just learned to carry the weight. Harold, with teary eyes, held her hand. "No one has spoken to me like this since Margaret left," he said. "Maybe she's listening right now," Amelia replied, squeezing his hand. Days later, Harold decided to clean up the greenhouse. He spent a whole morning clearing dust, removing dry leaves, organizing pots. In a corner, he found a clay pot with a tag written in Margaret's handwriting, "For Harold's camellia." He stared at the pot as if it were a voice calling from the past. He replanted the camellia carefully, watered it, whispered something he hadn't said in a long time. "Thank you for waiting." That night, Harold sat on the porch again, this time not waiting for a letter or poem, just to breathe. On the table beside him, the white camellia was in bloom again, as if life, little by little, was letting itself be touched again. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the sun tinged the garden in gold when Harold found an old, dusty record player in the basement. He brought it to the main hall and with some effort got it working. The record he chose was Margaret's favorite, soft jazz from the 1950s. When the needle touched the vinyl, the sound filled the house like a breath of life. Amelia, arriving for tea, stopped at the door. Her eyes glistened with the melody. "I used to dance to this with my father, before the war," she said, almost whispering. Harold held out his hand. "Do you still dance?" She hesitated, then smiled. "I still remember the steps." And there in the middle of the room they danced, slowly, without rush. Two bodies marked by time, but two hearts that remembered the rhythm of affection. Days later, Harold showed Amelia a small carved wooden box kept in a secret compartment of the writing desk. It was a gift from Margaret, sealed since her passing. He never had the courage to open it. "Do you want to do it now?" asked Amelia gently. He nodded. Inside was a letter, written by Margaret during the last autumn before she got sick. "If one day you smile again, know that this will be my greatest gift. Love doesn't die, Harold. It only becomes silence. And I will be in that silence, hoping someone discovers that even the most tired hearts still deserve to be touched." Harold cried in silence. Amelia hugged him, saying nothing. The following month, Harold turned 79. He hadn't celebrated his birthday since Margaret's passing. But that year, something had changed. Amelia appeared with an apple pie and a single candle on top. Edith, the housekeeper, brought flowers from the garden. The gardener sang off-key. "It's not a party, just a reminder," said Amelia, "that we're still here." Harold blew out the candle, closed his eyes, and made a wish. Not for youth, not for lost time, but for courage, to live what was left with truth. The next week, Harold received a formal letter. A distant nephew, who had always been absent, wanted to discuss the sale of the mansion. He felt the weight of the decision. That house had been his refuge, but also a tomb of memories. He told Amelia. She didn't suggest answers. She just held his hand and said, "The house can be sold, but what you rebuilt inside yourself, no one can take away." That night, Harold replied to the letter firmly. The mansion was not for sale. For the first time, he realized there was still life there, and it deserved to go on. During a walk downtown, Harold and Amelia were approached by a very elderly woman. "Excuse me, are you Harold Whitmore?" He nodded, curious. "I knew your wife. She told me about you. Said that if one day I saw your eyes shine again, I would know she got what she wanted." Harold, moved, asked, "Who are you?" "I was part of Margaret's reading club. She spoke of you poetically. And she asked me one thing. If you ever see him happy, tell him I released him." Harold felt something break inside, not from pain, but from relief. Margaret had freed him. She knew this day would come. That night, Harold sat on the porch at sunset with a gentle smile. Amelia by his side, a steaming cup of tea in hand, looked at him as if she could see beyond his skin, straight into his soul. The lonely billionaire was no longer alone. And love now had two faces in his life, memory and presence. That same night, Harold went upstairs to Margaret's room. He hadn't entered it in years. The space was preserved, as if she could return at any moment. On the dressing table was a red-covered notebook, new, never used. Margaret liked to jot down thoughts, loose verses, childhood memories. Harold flipped through the blank pages, and there in that comforting solitude he wrote, "If someone ever reads this, know love doesn't die with time, it just changes form. Sometimes it becomes silence, other times flowers in the garden, and if we're lucky, it returns, in another way, with another name, but with the same warmth." He closed the notebook gently, as if ending a chapter, but not the story. The next morning, Amelia left a cup of tea on the porch before leaving. At the bottom of the cup, a small folded note. "Even when you thought you were alone, I saw your light." Harold held the note as if it were the last piece of a puzzle. The light he had turned on months ago, the silent gesture, was now a symbol of everything that had awakened. and he understood. Love hadn't returned to replace her, but to complete what she had started. The nephew's letter insisted. It said that maintaining a property like Whitmore Mansion was a waste, that Harold could sell it, travel, start fresh elsewhere. It spoke as if the house were a burden, not a sanctuary. Harold remained silent for days. Amelia respected that silence. She kept visiting him, bringing books, fruits from the market, and a kind of calm he didn't know he needed. But something was troubling him. "Do you think I'm clinging to the past?" he asked one day. Amelia took a moment before answering. "I think sometimes the past is a route, but it can also be an anchor. The difference is in how you choose to move." That night, Harold returned to the greenhouse. The camellias had bloomed again for the first time in many years. He sat with a sheet of paper in his hands. He began to write a letter to Margaret, but stopped halfway. The words wouldn't come, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had already said so much over so many lonely nights, in every sigh that echoed through the empty house. This time, it was different. Instead of writing to the past, he stored the blank paper away. As a symbol, that perhaps because it was time to write to the future. 2 weeks later, Amelia had to travel. One of her grandchildren was performing in a recital in another town, and she never missed those events. She gave Harold notice, but something in his gaze worried her. "I'll be back," she said before leaving. "I know," he replied, but his voice carried a hidden fear, the fear that the emptiness would return. In the days that followed, the mansion seemed quieter, but not empty. There were traces of Amelia everywhere. The watercolor on the wall, the scarf forgotten on the sofa, the herbal tea in the cupboard. Harold realized he wasn't regressing, he was missing someone. And that was a good thing. On a grey afternoon, Harold walked to the mansion's front gate. He carried a box. Inside were the sale contracts, Margaret's red notebook, the 1967 photo, and the medallion with the inscription, "So love may always find its way back." He buried the box under the oak tree where Margaret liked to sit. He did it without sadness, as someone who is planting something. There, he wasn't burying memories, he was planting the decision to stay, to remain there, but in a different way. The day Amelia returned, she found the house with open windows and soft music playing inside. On the porch, a set table with 2 cups, fresh cinnamon bread, and an envelope with her name on it. Inside, a sentence, "Maybe I'm ready to write to you too." She smiled, emotional. She sat down, poured the tea, and waited for him. When Harold appeared, he carried something simple yet powerful, a brooch shaped like a white camellia. "It was Margaret's," he said, "and I think she'd want you to wear it now." Amelia touched the brooch as if holding an old secret. "Then I'll wear it with honor," she replied. That week, Harold found a small polished stone covered in moss in the back garden. It was one of the stones Margaret had hand-painted, each with a word. He cleaned it carefully. The word was, "allow." He smiled. It was as if Margaret was still speaking to him, not asking him to forget, but to accept. That same day, he placed the stone on the flowerbed of the newly blooming camellias. As a quiet reminder, to allow oneself to live was the greatest act of love he could offer her, and himself. The following week, Harold and Amelia visited the cemetery where Margaret rested. They brought flowers, camellias just as she liked. Amelia stayed silent at a distance, respecting his space. Harold knelt and placed the painted stone at the base of the gravestone. "Thank you," he said softly, "for allowing me to love again." When he stood up, he didn't look back. He took Amelia's hand naturally, as someone who already knew the way, and they left. That same day, on the porch, Harold turned on the light, not to wait for someone, but out of habit, a new habit. Now that light didn't mean longing. It was simply a symbol that life was going on, and that even at 79, the heart could still choose to start over. The golden leaves were beginning to cover the path to Whitmore Mansion. Autumn had returned, as it always did, but everything was different now. Harold now tended to camellias with Amelia. The house, once still and silent, now smelled of baking, played soft jazz, and echoed with quiet laughter in the hallways. Even the paintings seemed more alive. There was something in the air, lightness, a rare kind of peace that only comes after deep sorrow. Harold no longer marked the days. He simply lived them. Amelia, with Harold's help, had transformed an old storage room into a small community library. They donated books, opened it to children from the town, and elderly women who came to revisit old romances. Margaret would have approved of this. Harold said as he hung a sign at the entrance. "For those who still believe in words." "She wouldn't just approve, she's in every page," Amelia replied, smiling. The place became a meeting point, and Harold, who used to avoid all contact, was now called Mr. Whitmore by the children, and even received drawings. One calm morning, Harold woke with an impulse. He picked up paper and pen, not for a note, but a long letter, the longest he had ever written. It was for Margaret, not for the past, but so he could finally close the cycle. "My dear, you were my first story, and no one will ever take that from me. But today I write to say that I'm ready to walk with gratitude, not just with longing. I've found someone who reminds me that love can be gentle as a whisper, and yes, the porch light still makes sense." He folded the letter carefully, tied it with a golden thread, and placed it inside an old book hidden among the volumes in the library. No one needed to read it. It just needed to exist. Harold and Amelia never talked about marriage, but one afternoon in the garden, he placed Margaret's medallion around her neck. "This is more than a ring," he said. "It's permission," Amelia cried. It was the most discreet and profound ceremony in town, just the two of them, a white camellia on the table, a cup of tea, and the wind whispering ancient blessings. There were no vows, just a look that said, "I'm here and that's enough." Years passed. Harold reached 84 with clarity and a gentle sense of humor. One winter afternoon, he asked Amelia to leave a chair for him on the porch next to hers. He looked out at the horizon with calm eyes. "When I go, don't turn off the light. Leave it on, okay?" "Why?" she asked, smiling gently. "Just in case someone is still searching." She held his hand, and there they stayed, in silence. Two hearts that had lived too much, and still knew. Love sometimes waits a lifetime. The next morning, Amelia found the note Harold had left on her desk. "You didn't arrive late, Amelia. You arrived exactly when I had stopped expecting, and that was the greatest gift." She read it slowly, then looked at the porch, the light still on, and at that moment, she knew the promise had been fulfilled. A few weeks after Harold's passing, Amelia asked the local carpenter to install a stone bench under the oak tree, the same one where Harold had buried the box with objects from the past. On the backrest, a simple inscription, "For those who still believe that love can wait." The bench quickly became a refuge. People sat there to think, to read, or simply let time pass. Some left flowers, others folded notes. The house remained alive, but now it belonged to everyone. Amelia found a manuscript among Harold's belongings. It was an unfinished book, a kind of diary, provisional title, "When Love Returns Slowly." There were stories, memories, reflections. She decided to publish the book, with help from the young people at the library. The cover was simple, a white camellia and a cup of tea. On the first page, she wrote, "This is the story of someone who almost gave up, and how silence, longing, and the porch light brought him back. Thank you for allowing me in." The mansion didn't become a museum, nor a tourist spot. It became something rarer, a place where memory didn't hurt. It embraced, and every Thursday, someone still turned on the porch light, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of respect, or perhaps out of hope. Because there are loves that, even when they end, continue to light the path for those who come after.